The Healthcare Security Cast is sponsored by 3D Network Technology. www.3dnetworktechnology.com.
Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast, the podcast dedicated to healthcare security, safety, and emergency management. If you are involved with a healthcare security program or desire to be, this podcast is for you. Join the conversation as we discuss the issues that matter to healthcare security professionals while leveraging the expertise of healthcare security thought leaders and experts in personal development. And now, here's your host, Brine Hamilton.
Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast for Monday, April the 20th, 2020. I'm your host, Brine Hamilton. Just want to remind everyone to connect with the Healthcare Security Cast community. We have a LinkedIn group and a Facebook group as well. Also, feel free to connect with me directly on social media. Again, my name is Brine, B-R-I-N-E, Hamilton. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And now for today's show, we'll be joined by Lindsay Lapaquette. Lindsay is a workplace communication expert, keynote speaker, trainer, and consultant. She'll be sharing some strategies on communication in the workplace. So get comfortable, take some notes. This podcast is filled with lots of useful information. And now, let's get into the show. All right, and we're joined on today's show by Lindsay Lapaquette. Lindsay, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to speak with you.
Now, let's start off by learning a little bit about you. Who is Lindsay Lapaquette?
Yeah, so I work with leaders who are really performance-driven, who want to master the people skills needed to bring their teams to a whole new level. So I really help leaders who have a big focus on, strategy and outcomes, but sometimes they've overlooked the importance of the people skills needed to really bring their teams to a higher level of performance and productivity. And so I basically do workshops, I do consultations and coaching, and really work to help kind of refine those people skills needed, because I really believe that when people feel seen and heard, they bring their best selves to work, and that when leaders can develop those skills to really connect with their team, and that their team members feel heard, that's really where people become more engaged and perform better in their roles.
All right, I'm going to ask you a bit of a loaded question. How did you get to this line of work? It's kind of a unique, very niche career that you're in right now.
Yes, so I'll try to give you the Coles Note version. So my background was as a speech language pathologist, and I was really special. A lot of people know speech therapists as people who fix lisps and stutters all day. And although I certainly did a bit of that work, I also got really specialized in working with clients with social interaction difficulties. And I worked a lot with clients who had various challenges that led them to have a hard time staying calm when they were interacting with others. And the more I practiced, the more I realized that our ability to interact, effectively with others is really intertwined with our ability to stay calm. Because when I called it the reactive zone of communication, when we're in this reactive zone, it's much harder to listen, to be collaborative, to take feedback without being defensive and things like that. And so I worked in that area clinically. And then I had two of my own kids who both have special needs who had these exact challenges. So I got really specialized in learning more and more about this, primarily to help the kids. And the deeper I got into it, and at the same time had some of my own life experiences that were quite challenging, which included the loss of both of my parents and also an uncle, I started to realize that how much I struggled with communicating well when I was being reactive. And at the same time, I was watching interactions around me at work and how others struggled similarly. And that was kind of the impetus for me to decide to make this shift. And I got into doing workshops and gradually started doing more and more until I realized that it was time to entirely change careers and focus on working with leaders, because I think leaders they're the model for the whole team. And they're the biggest impact point I can have in affecting this change in society, because they have a whole team that their behavior is being modeled after.
All right. And that being said, with a lot of leaders obviously moving up in their careers because of the skill sets that they do have and their high performance, I guess, if you will. So are you seeing that there's a lot of people who, I guess, maybe advance because of these skill sets, and then, there's a lack of the soft skills that are required to be effective?
You've hit the nail on the head. Yes, that was actually exactly where I realized that I needed to make this shift, was that realization of the fact that, exactly what you said, people are sometimes promoted for their skills without formal training or necessarily natural skill at connecting with others. And I guess I was seeing the toll that it took on teams, and I was seeing the levels of disengagement. To me, it just seemed to be continually increasing. And I think employee engagement and what's the word? Not loyalty per se, but having an employee really invested in what a company does, to me, that's the basis of productivity and performance. And so to help people who are really focused on performance outcomes, and I am too by nature, I am also, but I think we're missing the level of performance we can attain when we don't have the people skills necessary to manage all sorts of different personalities on a team. And that's where it gets really tricky, when you've moved up based on skill and you're managing a whole bunch of different personalities that are different from your own.
Right. Now, the one thing that I'd actually like to start off by touching on is communication as it relates to managing employee performance.
Mm-hmm.
You say in some of your materials that reprimanding ineffective behaviors is not a good way to address performance issues. Why would you say that is?
Yeah, so maybe I should start by defining what I mean by reprimanding, because I'm not saying that it's bad to give employees feedback or negative feedback about their performance. In fact, I think that's quite important. By reprimanding, I mean the way it's said. So sort of in a negative, judgmental, somebody being told, hey, look, when you did this, this was not okay. I think we've probably all sat through these meetings, right, where somebody is told quite sternly in front of others sometimes that what they've done is not okay. And when I say reprimanding, the purpose of those conversations is not necessarily to identify where the breakdown was and to find solutions. It's more that the leader is frustrated and they're taking their frustration out on someone else who, frankly, is in a position hierarchically that leaves them in a difficult position to stand up and say something. So I don't think reprimands are the best way to manage performance, because I think it puts the employee in a position where they either shut down and disagree but don't dare say that, or they become reactive themselves and start arguing back. And both of those I call the reactive zone of communication instead of the receptive zone, because we're not able to engage in a back and forth conversation. And so reprimanding, it's basically like slapping a kid on the hand for taking an extra cookie, right? We're telling them, hey, you've been a bad kid. And I think we can all acknowledge that as adults, it's not really the way we want to be spoken to. And I don't think it gets to the conversations that need to be had to figure out how to improve the performance, essentially.
The one thing actually I'd like to touch on as well, you've talked both about the reactive and the receptive zones. Can you just give a really brief definition of those just for the rest of the conversation?
Absolutely. So the receptive zone of communication, for me, that's the zone where you're calm and you're attentive and you're feeling relaxed and you're really able to engage in a back and forth open conversation. And so for me, I'm in the receptive zone, let's say, If I've gone camping for a weekend, I'm feeling very replenished and I can come home and I can have a difficult conversation. The reactive zone of communication is the zone where we're not necessarily consciously aware of how we're feeling about things that are being said. And so we're just sort of unconsciously reacting. So an example might be, just to give it a good, clear distinction from my personal life, if I'm in the receptive zone of communication and I walk into the house and let's say, I don't know, the kids have left all their dishes in the TV room, I might just say to them, hey guys, don't forget you're supposed to bring in your dishes. Or I could even say, if you don't bring your dishes in again one more time, you won't be allowed to eat in the TV room. If I'm in the reactive zone, I'm going to come in and say, hey, I've told you this isn't allowed. I'm going to be much less, I'm going to be more judgmental. I'm going to be more aggressive in my tone versus being assertive. And the outcome of that is that people aren't going to listen or are going to fight back. Whereas when you're in the receptive zone, you're in a state where you can really have a back and forth conversation. People aren't getting defensive and they aren't getting overly aggressive. And the thing is that one party can be in one zone and the other party can be in another zone. The only thing we can control is the zone we're in, right? So if someone else is being reactive, it's still our responsibility to do the best we can to stay in the receptive zone.
Now, that being said, how do we improve performance without reprimanding as you've structured it here?
Yeah. So listen, to me, the ideal conversation is one where the employee is actually identifying themselves where their challenges are. And so, you kind of want to start off by asking some open-ended questions, because that's going to give you a sense of where the employee sees themselves in the situation. So to make it a bit more concrete, let's say that they're turning in their monthly reports late every month. So you might just want to come in and say something like, oh, hey, I've noticed that the monthly reports have been late the last couple of months. Can you give me an idea of what's been going on? Right? So that's coming in more open-ended versus saying, the reports are late, they need to be in on time. It affects everyone when you're not getting them done, you're not being conscientious, etc. So to open it up, and you can get a sense of where they are at, and then you still can certainly give feedback as to, what needs to be done. So I'm not saying it's not okay for a leader to say, listen, it is very important. These need to be done by the 30th. And if you're seeing a few days or a week in advance, it's not going to be done in time. I need you to come and tell me this. That's okay. But the conversation has to start a little more from a perspective where whoever is in a leadership position is listening more to understand before we give the feedback. Otherwise, the person's not going to feel heard, and whatever the person in a leadership position says may just go in one ear and out the other.
All right. Now, you touched on feedback quite a bit there. Now, just out of my curiosity, do you find that people tend to focus on feedback as something that has to be negative? And if so, do you think it's equally important or more important to provide positive feedback as well?
So that's an interesting question, and one I've never really thought about, but I do think we have a tendency to zone in on negative situations. I think our brains have a bias towards going towards the negative. So whether intentional or not, I do think that tends to be a tendency. If you look at just, let's say, Yelp reviews, right? People will go on and write a negative review and they don't take the time to write a positive one. So absolutely, I think it's very important to give that positive feedback, because I think it is what allows people to hear the negative feedback. Now, the thing to be careful, you may have already heard, there's something called the feedback sandwich, where you give one positive feedback and one negative and one positive. The thing is, people can kind of pick up on that sometimes, right? That's a known technique. So you want to be genuine in when you're giving the positive feedback and not just giving it because you're preparing to give negative feedback. I think that needs to be a balance throughout the day. or the month, you know?
Now that being said, what are some ways that we can deliver effective feedback?
Yeah. So for me, the feedback really needs to be direct. It needs to be clear and honest. So what I see a lot is either people will go one of two ways. They'll either give very direct, harsh feedback where somebody feels almost scolded, and you know that may seem effective for some employees because it may make some employees work harder, but those employees are often doing so out of fear, right? They're afraid to lose their job and they're going to scramble more. But that's not necessarily the culture we want to create, because those people will not necessarily be happy in their jobs. So that feedback I see either given in that really harsh way, or I see it given in sort of an overly kind, almost dancing around this subject a bit too much. And so then people sometimes either don't even understand or realize where the corrective feedback lies, or they can kind of choose to ignore it because there's no consequences to, but there's no, the leader's position is so fluctuating or so weak, I guess, right? The boundaries are so weak. So for me, the sweet spot is sort of in between, where you can hold the line on what needs to be done and do it with empathy and with kindness, but also have clear expectations around performance, but also be open to listening to the employee's perspective about it, because sometimes it's more about identifying where the gap is, right? We're expecting a certain level of performance. What is blocking us from getting there? And how can we identify what the challenges are? And then how can we together identify what kind of supports the employee needs to get to that level of performance? And that's where it breaks down a lot, I find, when teams can't have those conversations to delve into those details because people are getting defensive or shutting down and aren't listening. They can't get to the bottom of why things aren't working to really sustainably change it.
All right. And one of the things that you touched on there too is just really what's motivating the employees. Now, within your work, you also speak about the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Would you mind explaining the differences and just how they would impact the behaviors of your employees?
Sure. So intrinsic motivation is really sort of that internal driving force that we're all born with, right? So as a baby, let's say, we seek to get a smiling reaction from other people, right? That's an intrinsically driven, that social connection is intrinsically driven, or it comes from within the baby, right? External motivation is when we're getting something for what we're doing. So I'm going to give you examples related to kids now. I'm going to bring it to work in a moment. So related to kids, that extrinsic motivation might be when you were a child, you were told if you cleaned your room, you get an allowance. So you're being given something to do something you're being asked. And I think we've grown into adults then who follow the model that we had it as children. So if we had a model in our homes of intrinsic motivation being rewarded, so the things that motivate us from within, it might be that you really like challenges, or you might be really driven by creativity, or you might be really driven by connecting with others, or you might be really driven by enjoying solving problems. If those needs can be satisfied, then often that is what the person is looking for in their jobs. Whereas when we look at compensation packages or reward packages at work, we're often giving external motivations. So people might get a bonus for high performance, or promotions, or things like that. And there's nothing wrong with using those types of motivations, but the problem is that if intrinsic motivation, or that internal desire to perform and follow your passion, is missing, it really still affects somebody's performance and, frankly, their well-being. Because we're all biologically driven to have those internal or those intrinsic needs met. And when they're not met in our jobs, people end up miserable, frankly.
That being said, as leaders, what are some of the things that we can do to foster that intrinsic motivation in our staff?
So I think one of the first things is it's important to learn what motivates each of our different employees and to make sure that there's a fit between what they need and what their job tasks and their responsibilities entail. So I'll give you some examples here. Myself, I'm somebody who has a high need to be challenged in my work. So rote tasks are more difficult for me. I need a high level of autonomy. And so although I can work as a team, if I'm put in a position where I have to be in team meetings 6 hours a day, I start to have a lot of trouble. I need a lot of flexibility also. So I need to be on projects that allow a lot of creative out of the box thinking. And so when you're looking at the ideal job for me, for instance, it would not be something very repetitive where, like I said, that I'd have to work on a team 6 hours a day, whereas I might have a colleague who could do those tasks extremely well and would excel at those, right? There are people who love really structured settings. So if we can figure out what each employee needs and match their job tasks, so not just looking at, you're an engineer and so here's what you're going to do, but stepping back from your professional title, personality wise, what do you need to be happy? And often you can find that out just from having conversations and being observant and trying to be flexible in matching job tasks to a person's needs and interests so they stay intrinsically motivated.
Right. And then I guess from a perspective of ourselves as leaders, there's a certain level of self-awareness that's required to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that you mentioned in your work as well is that it's a negative thing when everybody on your team just arbitrarily agrees with you. And I think it's easy for some people to overlook that. But I guess just for context, why is that a bad thing when there's no disagreement with you as a leader?
Yeah, so my perception is that if everyone always agrees with everything you say, leader or not, I just don't believe it. I just don't believe that every single thing that comes out of somebody's mouth, that everybody around them thinks the exact same way they do. That's just, human beings are way too complex. So although this is sometimes seen as a great sign, I always sort of question what the culture is like, and do people feel safe raising different opinions, and is there a history of being able to respectfully debate different opinions? So I was working with a team recently where there had been a change of management recently, but previously my understanding is that there were very harsh communication from management was very harsh. And what I saw when I worked with the team was a team who wouldn't necessarily address issues directly with people who it needed to be addressed with. And I think because that had been shut down for so many years. So the reality is that it looked on the surface like people agreed because nobody would dissent in a meeting, but then people would go out in the hall and complain, and people were kind of sabotaging, not doing their work properly. And to me, those are all behavioral repercussions of an environment where people haven't been able to express differences of opinions and had that be heard. And I think that if someone has a difference of opinion and they feel heard, they can get on board with doing something they disagree with. But if their perspective will not be heard at all, they don't ever truly get on board, even if they'll do the work for you. And I think that means they're not working as hard, honestly.
Well, that's fair. And it seems like part of it too is that in that specific example, there's a little bit of battling the past perceptions.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess looking at it as it relates to shaping these perceptions, what steps can we take to ensure that we're not making demands versus making requests?
Mm-hmm. So it's an important distinction. And I think, first of all, just being conscious that we never know everything about a situation that is not our own situation. So even if you're a leader and you see your team every day and you've assigned them their projects and you oversee it really well, the reality is you cannot know every single task that employee is expected to. Maybe somebody from another department has asked them for some help, or maybe there's something going on in their home life you're not aware of that's impacting them. So the first step is just being really conscious that we don't know everything about a situation. And so it's really important that when we're asking somebody, when we need somebody to do something, we don't just come in and say, you need to do this by this deadline, and that's just the way it is because it needs to be done, because we don't understand the other types of what everything else they're juggling. So it's absolutely important that the leader expresses their needs and specifically tells the employee what they need. But rather than say, I need this by 5 no matter what, you could say, I need this by 5. It's really important. How can we make this work? So that opens the door to the employee to say, okay, I'm working on this other project that's also supposed to be done by 5. Which one do you need me to prioritize? Because I think that's where people often don't feel heard, is when they're being told what to do and they feel that the leader doesn't have a good understanding of everything they're juggling and isn't open to listening about it.
No, I would agree. That's definitely a really good point. It's really easy for us to lose sight of some of those things and feel like we know everything, or kind of need to be in control of everything. But that's it's a really good point.
Well, and you make a good point there regarding control, because I think that feeds into it sometimes. That when there's a need to control every aspect of everything going on, I think that also leaves employees to feel not trusted, and so it's really a balance. I see it as working together as a partnership versus a leader and their employee or their team member. Yes, there's a hierarchy there, but when there's a perception that, I'd almost say when there's a perception that one is better than the other or more valuable than the other, or, that kind of, when we get into that kind of thinking, it gets to be quite damaging, I find.
Okay, I want to actually shift focus a little bit from the one-to-one or the smaller group communication, and kind of shift towards larger groups. So seeing that we're in kind of a more politically correct climate these days, how do we set appropriate boundaries around personal opinions in workplace discussions?
Yeah, so I think this stems a lot from the top in the organization. And I think the leaders have a real responsibility to ensure that discussions take place respectfully. So we can disagree about situations, we can have problems with certain behaviors that employees may be demonstrating, but I think we have to keep it sort of separated from the person being faulty versus there being challenges with their performance, let's say. And so we need to be careful. Those who are in leadership positions, and frankly, everyone within an organization, needs to be careful when they're using labels to describe people. So I see this so frequently in discussions where, let's say somebody's talking about an employee's performance and they'll say, he's really disorganized, he doesn't get his work done on time, he's sloppy in the precision of what he does, right? So they're talking about, they're using these adjectives like disorganized and sloppy to describe the person, right? And so right away it becomes personal. And we have to be careful because sometimes there are personal things that may be kind of bothering us about this employee, but we need to be a little more objective and separate it so that instead of using those adjectives to describe the person, we describe the behaviors we don't like. So for instance, his work reports are not in on time. There are details missing when he finalizes his reports. This part of the report specifically has not been completed with adequate detail in the last few months. And so it takes away from criticizing the person and again, takes it out of that realm of that person's opinion and makes it a little more objective and frankly, a little more politically correct. But for me, it's beyond being politically correct. It's about treating people with respect, right? And so if the leaders can do that, and if they catch those people speaking about others in those kind of terms in meetings, if they can catch it and reframe it into different terminology and different words, and even say things, specifically address it and say, rather than talking about this quality of the person, let's bring it back to the behavior. I think it sets a tone where speaking in that way is not acceptable within the organization. For me, that's a really important piece of people feeling safe to know that they will not be described in terms like that when they inevitably do something wrong, because we're all going to have challenges in our workplaces, inevitably.
Right. And the one thing that really stuck out for me that you just said there is the piece about focusing on the behaviors.
Yeah.
I find that's one thing that's really easy to kind of overlook and just kind of focus on what we don't like. And like you said, characterize it as, attaching a specific quality to that person. Whereas it could be very situational. And I have that all the time where there's an issue with one of the employees, and I have to really push and say, okay, well, what are the behaviors? What are the
Right.
behaviors that we're focusing on? And I think too, you may agree or disagree with me, but I think one of the things too is nobody's good at everything, but nobody's bad at everything as well. So for all of these specific weaknesses, I'm sure like a glaring weakness, there's some kind of converse strength that comes, that goes in hand with that.
Yeah. And I love what you said about everyone's not bad at everything. And I think that's where getting into using words like adjectives to describe the person is it shifts us into that thinking that person is bad at everything, right? And that's what we're wanting to stay away from. The other thought I had when we were speaking is that I have more of a tendency of slipping into forgetting to speak about the behaviors when I'm in the reactive zone of communication. So when I'm not as calm, when I haven't taken care of myself as well, it's harder for me to keep that objectivity. And so at the core of it, really, the more we can ensure as individuals that we're doing what we need to be able to stay calm during difficult interactions, the more we're going to be able to focus on those behaviors versus the person being the bad guy.
Right. And especially too when we speak in generalities, like I just did there, and I said everything.
Right.
My son's really good at reminding me when we do things like this. If we say you always do this, and I used to do this as a kid too, and I did it to be annoying, but he's doing it out of sincerity, where he'll say, I don't do it all the time. I'm not doing it right now. Right. So
Yes. And I use things like that too, but I think it's having the awareness to catch ourselves. So I also try to catch myself when I'm saying always and never. Chances are that's not true. And it's another indication to myself that I'm slipping into that zone where, my communication isn't quite as conscious, and not that it always needs to be, but I think we just need to be careful when we're speaking about others, how we're doing it, because that there's a lasting mark of that on people's lives. And I think especially when you're in a leadership position, you have a responsibility to be really careful how you're speaking about others and to do it respectfully.
right. And you touched on this earlier, just the working with the different personalities, and we do work with people of all sorts of personalities, and I think that's very important for many reasons. For someone who doesn't contribute to conversations or who doesn't contribute at all to discussions, how could we encourage them to be more active in these situations, or should we focus on following up maybe after the fact?
Mm-hmm. Well, so one of the things I always look at in these situations is the environment or the culture within the organization or the team one where people feel safe speaking up? Because although there's obvious differences in how comfortable different people are speaking up in groups, I've worked extensively with the Cree up in James Bay, a First Nations group, and their communication styles are very different than my own and others, from, we call it down south, the Montreal area, let's say. And what I've realized is that although I perceived there to be introversion at first, it was often because feedback they might contribute wasn't always respected, I guess, by those who are non-Indigenous and who didn't have an understanding of their culture. And it led me to reflect on how those same dynamics play out just in general organizations down here. So I think the first step is looking at when people bring up a different opinion, is that even if people disagree, is that done respectfully? Do people feel safe sharing their ideas? So that's the first step. And then beyond that, leaders can do things, for instance, like trying to manage the more extroverted people in the group. So that would be somebody like me who tends to be really chatty. And, you can say something like, okay, thanks, Lindsay. We've heard your perspective. Now, just a minute, I want to give a chance for, and then you can name somebody who tends to be a little quieter and say, I'm interested what he or she may have to contribute. I think what's tricky here is you don't want to be forcing somebody introverted to have to speak when they're uncomfortable, because I think that will make things worse. So you want to invite them without pressure. And then you can always ask, the leader can always pull that person aside and say, hey, you always have such great insights when we're discussing this project. I'd really love it if you'd share those with the team today. Is that something you'd feel comfortable doing? So make them see why you value their feedback so much. Invite them to do so without forcing. And what I see is over time, if you can balance the space that the more chatty people take, the people who tend to be a little quieter will slowly start to contribute a bit more. And I find that when they do, it brings a whole other perspective, because they tend to be really good observers. So there's a lot of things they may be noticing that no one else has picked up on that's important for the company to know.
All right. And actually, you touched on the one thing that I was kind of thinking here. I guess conversely, someone who contributes too much. If someone has a habit of interrupting, what are some of the other things that we can do to kind of curtail that?
Yes. So that would be me. I was raised 4 kids in the family. I think a lot of the kids in my family had undiagnosed ADHD, and you had to interrupt to be heard. And it's a habit I have hard tried to break, but I'm simply impulsive. And so I've noticed that some things that people have done with me that are very effective. I have quite an introverted colleague I worked with several years back, and she would say to me, hang on, Lindsay, I'm not just done yet. And because I'm very aware of my tendency to interrupt, and I've done enough work to know that that's not a criticism of me. She's just reminding me that I was interrupting her. It was a really effective cue for me to remember, okay, step back, And so sometimes it's just something as general as that, is maybe sitting down with the whole team to say, we're wanting to work on making sure that everyone gets heard, and what are some techniques we would like to use as a team when somebody is taking too much space, and what techniques shall we use if we need to invite somebody to take space. And it needs to be things the team feel comfortable with. So if people feel, like for instance, if I felt really ashamed every time my colleague had said that to me, that wouldn't have been terribly effective. But if it's done respectfully, that's just a simple way to encourage the more chatty people to not contribute as much.
All right. Now, from the perspective, because you brought this up of realizing this on your own, being self-aware, and if you see yourself as the interrupter, either as a leader or in a setting where maybe you're not the leader of a specific meeting, what are some of the things that we can focus on to address that, so we're not constantly interrupting?
That's an excellent question. It's one I have not completely found the solution to for myself. So, I mean, one is observing the nonverbal cues of those around you, right? Because the interruption can sometimes come from, so for me, it's impulsivity. And so sometimes I just get so excited about an idea and I'm talking before my brain has even realized it. And So I haven't found a good solution to that. But sometimes it comes from a lack of observing what's going on in the room and not noticing the nonverbal cues people are giving that they haven't finished, or not noticing that a pause doesn't mean it's your turn to speak. So one thing that somebody could do is, if they're pausing to think, for instance, an introvert is talking and just needs a second to process, the team could agree that that person will not put up their hand like in school, but just kind of raise their hand a little bit as a sign to everyone else, I'm thinking, don't take my space, So sometimes it's just having that consensus of what does our team need so that everyone can get the chance to express themselves the way they need. And I do really see that being the leader's responsibility to navigate those dynamics in a team. And what I see often is that the more extroverted, chatty people take up a lot of this space, and it affects, I think, how much the more introverted people feel valued on their team, which is damaging to team dynamics overall, if not worked on and managed by the leader.
Just in light of everything that's happening with COVID-19, a lot of us now are working from home, or we have employees working from home. In this current environment, what are some of the ways that we can support our employees that are working from home?
Mm-hmm. So I think nowadays one of the biggest keys is, well, there's two. One is flexibility. And the second one is really making sure your employee feels that they are understood. Because I think now more than ever, people are under extreme amounts of stress, some more than others. And to me, what's going to make the difference nowadays between an employer of choice and future is how people are being treated today. So first of all, connecting to your employees to make sure that you understand the pressures they are under at home in trying to work from home. So I've heard so many different stories, anything from, families with 6 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment, and both parents are trying to work 9-to-5 jobs. And, you go ahead now and tell me how easy that challenge sounds, versus, say, somebody who lives alone in whatever size place, and they're actually struggling maybe to focus because they're really understimulated and bored. And so I think trying to understand each individual's very different scenario. We see everyone's working at home and we kind of think everyone's under the same pressures, and that's not the reality. So as a leader, if you can understand that and work with your employee to try to find solutions that fit their needs and your needs for the company, I think that goes a really far way. And then, like I said, flexibility. I do understand there are certain needs for a company that must be met. The same is true for a family, though. So I had one person tell me their boss had told them they expect their employees to not have anything to do with their children in their 7-hour workday. That's not realistic for somebody who has a younger child. So again, bringing whatever flexibility you can to that employee's current situation that also meets the needs of the company. And that might be, if they're not client facing, they don't need to be, let's say, on the phone with clients. Can they break up their work and work 6 to 9, and then maybe, 1 till 3 while their kids are napping, and then again from, I haven't calculated the hours, but 9 to midnight, or I don't know exactly how that would work out, but are there ways that the employer can adjust so that their employee at the end of the day isn't burning out? Because my biggest concern with the demands people are under is that our second wave pandemic is going to be a mental health crisis, because people are under a lot of stress right now. So I think whatever leaders can do to support their employees will bring them back to higher levels of productivity faster.
Right. And that's a really good point as well. Now, one thing that's kind of been standing out a lot in this conversation is not just from the standpoint of working from home, but also just when we're back to working in a regular environment, it's really important to understand the individual aspects of all of our employees. Now, do you have any recommended resources or any tips that you could offer just to be able to better pick up on some of those differences? As I know, it doesn't come naturally for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so I mean, off the top of my head like this, the thing that popped into my head was DISC assessments, which is something I'm trained in. And a DISC assessment really gives the employee fills in a questionnaire, and it gives a really nice portrait of what that person's needs are. And so I find that very informative, but it's not usually the core of my work. But I think too, a lot of the answers come from having conversations with your employees. And for an employee to feel they can share with you what they truly need, or what their personality needs are, they just need to trust that that's not going to be judged, or that they're not going to be told that's not okay. So for instance, if someone's, let's say right now, being expected to be on Zoom meetings 7 hours a day, and they're finding that's, really affected, like myself, that's really affecting my ability to concentrate right now. The employee can learn a lot, the employer can learn a lot just by having those conversations, and you get to know the employee's different needs when you'll listen to them when they share them, I think.
Right. And, I'm actually really glad that you brought up the DISC assessment. Just for myself, I found that to be something that was really effective just for my own self-awareness and understanding how I interact with people within the different quadrants of their personalities. It's a very effective tool. I'll actually put I'll put some links in the description as well for anybody listening.
Yeah, I found the same when I did it myself. It brought me even more awareness into, not only into my own patterns, but into some of the conflicts I get into and why that is and how to resolve them.
Right. Now, we've covered a lot in this conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to share that I haven't brought up to this point?
No, I don't think so. I think you've really done a good tour of how leaders can really support their employees. And I think, like I said earlier, for me, a lot of this is really the foundation to employees being really invested in their jobs. And I think that's what brings high performance. And I think that's what everyone is looking for, nowadays.
Right. Excellent. And I think what I'd like to do is kind of end off the same way we started. And that's, just by talking about you. What are some of the things that you're currently working on that you'd like to share with us? Like, what can we expect in the future?
Yeah, I have so many ideas. We'll see how much time my kids give me through this pandemic. So one of the things I've done, obviously, like everyone else, is I've done a lot of online work in past, but I've moved to 100% online with my workshops. So I do live workshops online, and I'm continuing to do, coaching and consultations. One thing that I'm just starting as of next week is I've decided to offer my consultations for free. Like I was saying to you earlier, I feel a real need to give back to the community during this time, and I've reflected a lot on how I can do that. And so if there are any leaders who are finding themselves and their teams struggling through this period, who want to work on some of those people skills needed to bring their team back to a level of performance and productivity, I'm offering free consultations, and people can check that out. My link on it's calendly.com/Lindsay Lapaquette. And then aside from that, I also have plans to start my own podcast, hopefully in the next little while. I'm trying to figure out some of those details. And then I'll be putting together an online course probably in the next few months. So you can keep an eye out for all that. And if people want to get on my mailing list to hear when those things are coming out, it's on the homepage of my website, which is lindsaylapaquette.com. You can join my mailing list there.
Excellent. Now, personally, I connected with you on LinkedIn. How do you prefer people reach out to you, through the website or through LinkedIn, or do you have a preference?
People can reach out to me any way that they would like to. I will say I'm probably most responsive by either email or LinkedIn, but I do eventually get to all of my different channels.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time, Lindsay. There's a lot of good, valuable information in this conversation.
Well, thanks. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
And this concludes another episode of the Healthcare Security Cast. Just a reminder to connect with us on Facebook and LinkedIn on our group pages there. Also, we want to say a special thank you to our sponsor, 3D Network Technology. Until next time, stay safe and take care.